This episode of the Cosmic Skeptic podcast is brought to you by you. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic. So welcome back, everybody, to the Cosmic Skeptic podcast. For a short time, the number 2 philosophy podcast in the United Kingdom. And I want to remind you that the reason that we were able to have that accolade was because of the fact that you were voting on iTunes. I want to remind you that it only takes a second to open the podcast app, which comes with every single iPhone. Have you done that?
No.
Oh, you don't use
it
iPhone.
must happen.
But or you can go onto iTunes and you can give the Cosmic Skeptic podcast a rating of 5 stars. It just helps analytics on iTunes. It produces, it puts our content on the front page, on the trending pages, and allows us to have better stats, reach out to better guests. And speaking of great guests, I'm joined in the studio today by my good friend Stephen Woodford, who most of you will know from the YouTube channel Rationality Rules, a channel which discusses everything from religious claims and atheism to the flat earth to more recently the issue of transgender athletes and Brexit as well. You've really been pushing the boat out there.
I decided to have a little go at politics.
Yeah, so thanks for joining me. It's good to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So the reason that I've got you here, Stephen, is because of the fact that, as followers of my YouTube channel will know, we've had many previous discussions on the issue of morality. And we had a discussion together that was quite long on my channel. And then you made a video about your views on morality. I made a video called Rationality Rules Debunked. And then you made a video called Cosmic Skeptic Debunked. And it's kind of left in the air. Like, I criticize you criticize me, and people have been saying, what's next? So I thought that the best way to settle this dispute that we've been having is to get you on the new podcast and just talk it out. So where can we begin? I suppose originally, our views on morality were kind of summed up by you being a moral objectivist and me being a moral subjectivist.
Yeah,
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's fair to start with.
Do you think that, like, have your views significantly changed since our first conversation?
I think yes is probably a fair answer to that. But from a shallow point of view, no. It looks the same, but there's significant alterations that have happened since then. So yes is the answer, but it doesn't look like it on the surface. For example, I still believe that morality is objective, but I think that I've learned a lot since having our conversation, since reading more literature, and since digesting your video and digesting the videos and the content of other people who have things to say on the topic. So it has changed for sure.
Yeah. So originally, we spoke about the morality of Sam Harris, and he is a moral objectivist.
Yeah.
What do we mean when we're talking about ethics and we're talking about morality? What do we mean to say that morality is objective? What's that? Like, when you say something is objective,
yeah,
what is that sort of ascribing to the quality that we're discussing?
I think really one thing I've noticed with having discussions on this topic is that it can fall into a realm of semantics, and a lot of people can fall off the track thinking they're arguing words. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening, although the words are very important, because as I said in one of my videos, while I think that we've outgrown religion, we haven't outgrown religious language, and that's particularly the case when it comes to morality. So when we say that something is objective in science, what we're saying is that it's verifiable through objective means, which means that if you say that, the Earth is a sphere, well, it's not your personal opinion that the Earth is a sphere, although it kind of is as well. When you're saying it as an objective fact, what you're saying is that we can verify this via objective means, and so you can go out and do that, and other people can test it. This is what something means in the scientific realm when it comes to objectivity. I think that morality is objective in the scientific sense, like that, but it is subjective in what I've previously called a philosophical sense, which is to say that without subjects such as us, it doesn't exist. I would put it in the same category as saying that your sexual, we call it sexual preferences, but I think this is the wrong term to call it. Your sexual desires, your sexual alignments are objectively the case. They can be verifiably shown.
Are you saying that morality can be verifiable in the same sense that something like sexual orientation can be? So in,
Yes.
in the sense that like your moral preferences are objectively verifiable in the same way that your sexual preferences are. But if I were to say something like you should have sex with a man instead of a woman, that is not an objective statement in a philosophical sense.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Because that's kind of based on a subjective desire. Okay, so I think that the base of our disagreement originally was that I was finding this basis of morality to be in subjective thought. The way that I viewed it was that if you say that something is wrong, what you're essentially expressing is an opinion, or at the very least, you're expressing a reasoned conclusion that's based on objectively verifiable facts and objective reasoning, but that kind of finds its way from a subjective starting point. So for me, it's like, if I say murder is wrong, I can say that murder is wrong is an objective corollary of saying something like it is wrong to unnecessarily harm people. Right? It just necessarily follows that murder is wrong. And it might be wrong to unnecessarily harm people because it's good to seek the overall pleasure. And it might be good to seek the overall pleasure because it's good to seek my own pleasure, which is intrinsically linked. But my point was that when you break that down to the very last point, you end up with simply the subjective opinion that my pleasure is good.
Yeah.
Now, that was kind of the point of disagreement, which is me saying that because if all morality is based on essentially well-being, which we think it is, I think that's where we can agree, and people can watch our previous discussions on YouTube to see where we're up to on that point. If we can agree on that, then the discussion just becomes, well, is it objectively true or subjectively true that we should value our well-being? And my point was that it's subjectively true. Is that something that you agree with or
so
not?
this is where that confusion of words comes into play. But so far as what I hear there, yes, I agree. In that sense, it's a bit like, I'm trying to think of the best way to approach it, but it seems that on that level and what you've just said there, yes, I'm with you on that sense. I think people ask more of moral questions than they do with other questions,
Right.
which hopefully we can delve into today, and I can unravel a little further.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the way that people treat morality and ethics differently to how they treat other areas of philosophical inquiry.
Sure.
Because this is the point that you really made to me that made me realize that I might have got this wrong. Now, I stand by everything that I've ever said or criticized about the views that you've held, but the thing that's really changed for me is the context in which I'm thinking about them.
Yeah.
So I still stand by the fact that all morality is based on subjective desire, and that subjective desire is a desire for our own pleasure.
Yeah.
So I can reason moral conclusions like you shouldn't do this because of the fact that it's going to affect our pleasure, and I think that my own pleasure is a good thing. But I still stand by the fact that it's only my opinion that pleasure is a good thing. But what you made me think about was whether that's inconsistent with things like epistemology or induction. So one of the big sticking points for morality that we've discussed before is the is-ought distinction. David Hume's is-ought distinction, which, for those who don't know, essentially is just the observation that no ought statement can be logically derived from is statements. No normative or prescriptive statements can be derived from descriptive sentences. I can say it is the case that it's raining, and it is the case that I don't want to get wet, therefore I should take an umbrella.
Yes.
That doesn't logically follow.
No, it doesn't at all.
Because you need to have the premise that I should do what brings me pleasure. I should do what avoids the pain and discomfort of getting wet. So it may be the case that I don't like getting wet, but it might not necessarily be the case that I should act in accordance with that. So in order to get that should in the conclusion, you need the should in the premises. And so that's a big sticking point, which is that you can have as many objective facts about the universe as you like, but you'll never get to an ought statement. No. But another thing that David Hume points out, which you quite rightly picked me up on, Stephen, is the famous induction problem, which is essentially you can whittle it down to the induction is the inference of information and fact about the unobserved world from the observed world. And part of the unobserved world is the future. By definition, it's unobserved. So just as Hume would say you can't get an ought from an is, he'd also say you can't get a will be from an is.
Yeah.
So you can't reason, it is the case that the sun has risen every day so far, and therefore it will be the case that it will rise tomorrow. You can't actually know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Now, this is a big problem. Like, philosophically speaking, the problem of induction is at the very basis of epistemology. We can't know any facts about the future or about the unobserved world. I can't know that gravity will continue to work if I try to drop something right now. Even though it may be the case that it has worked, it doesn't follow that it will work. And yet, for some reason, people are kind of willing to just put that to the side and say, well, it's still, in any sense that's meaningful, it is objectively true that if I drop this pencil, it will fall to the floor, that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, if we're willing to do that across the is-will-be divide, why aren't people willing to do it for the is-ought divide?
It's a great question. And I really do think it comes down to language and like the cultural context that we find ourselves in. It seems to me, to anyone that's studied epistemology, I think that the result that you'll get to is that you just don't know anything for certain. You can say, I think, therefore I am, but really you just get to this point where you realize that you're very much operating on assumptions. They're good assumptions, you may argue, but only under the rubric of assumptions that you've already made. And that's just to illustrate the point that you just made about getting a will be from an is. No one, when somebody makes an argument such as the sun has risen every day, although more accurately the earth has turned, therefore it will rise tomorrow. You don't get people going, oh, that's just nonsense, even though really it kind of is, because as Hume showed there, as he showed when it comes to is or as well, things just are so much more complex and so much less attached than we think they are. When it comes to morality, that's the kind of frustration that I have. It's like, okay, you can't, and also something to be made very clear is I don't think that you need to get an ought from an is at all. I actually think he is bang on correct with that. And that's something that's changed in my thoughts. I was thinking maybe you can get an ought from an is if you describe certain oughts as is. So it is the case that Alex believes he ought to Y. But that is just, again, it's semantics. You're working around it, at least you think, but you're not.
Right.
So you have that kind of area that happening in that circumstance.
Yeah. So for our audience, let's break it down. What essentially, because I think people can recognize quite trivially that in order to logically get an ought statement in a conclusion, you need some kind of ought premise. You need something in the beginning to get you there at the end. So you can construct a valid argument, like if you can have a premise that is, and you pointed this out, which is, if you know that you ought to promote the survival of your children,
Yes,
and then you take an is statement like it is the case that vaccines promote the survival of my children, then you can conclude logically validly that you should vaccinate your children.
Yeah,
that's a valid argument.
And something to add to that is that it's basically Kant's hypothetical imperative, or Kant's hypothetical imperative.
However you want to say it.
Pronunciation, good fun. Because that is what it is. He's saying that if you want to do X, then do Y, and that does follow.
So yeah, so you've got kind of, well, actually, we'll get into that in a second, because the important thing to recognize is that the only reason that's a valid argument, the vaccination one, is because of the fact that you've got that ought statement in the premise. That's the only reason you can get it from the conclusion. If you just had the premise, it is the case that vaccines promote the survival of children, you can't conclude the ought, because you just can't get there without the ought in the premise. So what you essentially tried to do in your video, if I'm understanding you correctly, Stephen, is you tried to identify certain ought statements that could be in the premises and that could be justifiably in the premises because of the fact that they are just axiomatically true.
Okay, so when it comes to certain statements such as I want to protect my child, what I was trying to drive at is that some of the oughts that we have, which is basically to say desires or impulses to do things, are really ingrained as us just as a species, as an entity. It's something that we didn't reason ourselves into. It's just there. So survival is a good example, which most people, for most of their life, have. It's that they just want to survive. There's no reasoning to it. It's just that is their standing point. I would say that almost everybody doesn't want to suffer in eternity. It's just, if you look at any organism, it's all about just avoiding the worst kind of hell possible. And so they already have this desire. The question then becomes, what's the best way to avoid it? And so what I'm saying is that they already have this ought value, if you will. And so there is already right and wrong answers in how they can go around achieving it.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not you want to say, is that justified? Probably not. But it is just a fact that they have it. And I find that whenever I talk to anyone who's speaking in any kind of form of morality, be it an atheist, anyone from the secular community or the religious, if you keep saying why, you'll always break them down to well-being. And this is why I'm saying that is an anchor that takes maybe one form or many that we can all operate from, because that's what it's all about. And that's basically what I was trying to convey.
Yeah. Okay. But so the important question for me is to discuss if it's the case that we if it is the case that we have these desires at the very it's sort of ingrained into the fiber of our being. We have this ingrained desire to survive, for instance. The important jump, and the jump that needs to be made for ethics, is to say that, okay, so it is the case that we want to survive, but how can we reason that it is the case that we ought to survive? Like, is there a meaningful difference to you between wanting to do something and it being the case that you should do that thing?
So for me, it's like what you're saying is that, we can recognize that we all have the feeling that we ought to survive. But does that mean we ought to have the feeling that we ought to survive?
Yeah, like we feel as though we ought to survive, but do we ought to survive?
I think that's where people apply the question, which is relevant, and it's a fair question to ask philosophically, where they won't apply that when it comes to getting a will be from an is. People don't operate like that in these kind of spheres, but they do when it comes to morality. I think that's where there's a mismatch.
There is one difference there, which is that
of course,
in the case of is and will be, although this doesn't work inductively to find conclusions about the future, but you can say that in the past, predictions that have been made about will be's from is statements have been found to be true. So previously, I've said it is the case that the sun will rise and therefore it will rise tomorrow. And then it did. Like, that's been proven to have worked. And that doesn't mean it will continue to work. That would be begging the question. But it has at least worked in the past. But there aren't any examples that we can objectively show of a similar thing happening with oughts. We can't show that there are past examples where an is has led to an ought and it be proven to have been correct. Right. It always remains in that area of a jump, of a kind of leap in logic.
So are you saying that we haven't seen an is come from an ought?
We haven't seen an ought come from an is.
An ought come from an is.
Yeah, we haven't seen it.
Yeah, no, we haven't.
We haven't seen it in the same way that but we have seen a will be come from an is in the past.
So you're saying we have seen a will be but you still have the problem of induction. The fact that we've seen it before and we've shown that it's verifiable and it can happen, doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be the same the next day.
I mean, it shows to me that there's at least a connection between those two things, because previously, again, it's important to press that even if induction has worked and been accurate right up until this point, it doesn't mean it will be in 5 minutes. But at the very least, we can show that there has been a precedent for a connection between the way things are and the way that they will be. Yeah, and that has been an unbroken chain.
You're left in this position where you go, okay, I don't know for sure, but I do have reasonable expectation based on decent observations.
But you haven't got the same thing for isn't ought, because there's no historical precedent.
What would be an example of what you're looking for then?
Well, the problem is, for me, I don't think there can be one, which is that I don't think there can ever be the case where you derive an ought from an is and somehow prove that was actually true or justifiable.
So to be crystal clear, I don't think you can get an ought from an is. You can't do it. Humour's right. But I've bent over backwards trying to figure it out. At this current point, I can't get around it, and I think he's absolutely right. What I'm saying is that if you have an ought, you can, and then if you have an ought, and your ought is, say, to survive, given that you have an ought to start with, then you can say it is the case that this is this and that is that, therefore you ought to do this because it fulfills that original ought that you have. What I'm saying is that people aren't born with a blank slate. We're not. We're just not. It seems that it's common sense to look at us, to look at ourselves like we are. We're not. We're just not. And we are born with these already oughts in us, which is to say, it doesn't mean we have to do it. It's just we have impulses, desires. Maybe ought is the wrong word for me to use. And that's one point that I definitely have digested from your response to me. Maybe I'm just confusing the situation more by trying to use the word or, even though I feel it's probably the most appropriate. Maybe it's not. Maybe I need to stick to impulse or something that isn't tethered to this situation. Because if you can't say ought to a philosopher without Hume being very much what's going to be spoke about. And so maybe that's a fault on my behalf. But to be crystal clear, I do not think you can get an ought from an is, and I don't think that's what I'm doing.
Okay, I think there's an important distinction to be made there, which and I do think that it was perhaps a mistake to use the terminology of oughts in the way that you were using them there, because you're right, and I think it's important to point out that we are born with certain predispositions, whether they be genetic or whether they be later sort of instilled sociologically in our socialization. We do have things within us which are these drives and these impulses. The problem for me, and what I try to explain in the video, and perhaps press the point a bit too far, almost to the point of like patronization. And I watch the video back sometimes, and I think like Stephen obviously knows this. I felt like I was kind of doing it more for the audience than for you, because like quite clearly there is a difference between having an impulse, having the feeling that you ought to survive. And I will completely agree with you that human beings are born with certain impulses. Yeah. The problem I had was that doesn't mean we can justify those impulses. Like what would happen if a human being was born, just had some kind of freak psychology, and it was just happened to be born with the impulse to rape?
Yeah.
Like then clearly we would have to say that, yeah, you have this impulse to rape, but like you shouldn't follow that impulse.
This is it. It should. That is it. Should. Yes, that's its ought. This is where people may shut off and think you can't be speaking about morality if you're saying that individual, that hypothetical situation results in that way. But you can, because morality means what's right and what's wrong. And for an individual, an entity that has that predisposition, that is what they ought to do.
Okay.
This is what I'm saying, is that's where the objective part comes into it. There's right and wrong ways to have those impulses. There's right and wrong ways to achieve what that predisposition is, if you will.
Now, I promise not to take you out of context and say something like,
it's fine.
If a child wants to rape, then we should just let them, everybody. But this is actually really interesting. So you can see why people would have a problem with a view of morality like yours. Yeah. If you're able to say something like, if somebody has an impulse to rape, then they should just act in accordance with that.
But his the subtlety.
And I think you know where I'm going as well. This is really important to just.
It is, and I'm glad that you brought it up. People don't have that kind of predisposition.
Right. Yeah.
And they also have many competing predispositions, pre-compulsions, if you will. Mm-hmm. If we're talking philosophy and strictly philosophy, it's okay to construe this entity that actually that is what their preference is, that is what their impulse is. But when it comes to reality, outside of philosophy, this is one of the weaknesses with philosophy, not so much with philosophy, I should say, it's with humans, is keeping them detached. This doesn't happen. We are an evolved mammalian ape, and as such, we don't just inherit physical attributes, we inherit a hell of a lot of psychological attributes. And we simply would not be alive with those kind of impulses being the ones that we're selected for. Instead, the ones that are selected for as a social species tend to be more empathetic, more along those lines. So while I can engage with it on a philosophical sense, and it helps unravel my thinking on this topic, it would be a big mistake to conflate that with what actually is the case. And I actually don't have a good defense against that happening. It's going to happen because people will say, as you just said, well, if you can do that with this form of morality that you're thinking of, then you're not talking about morality.
Right. And it's really important, because this is where I need to highlight a crucial distinction between our views, I think. Sure. And it's a distinction that will allow me to get out of that whole, to have a similar view to you, which is to say that we can sort of take what we desire and just act as though we ought to do so, and just act in accordance with that, but still be able to escape issues such as this case of somebody who just desires to rape, which is my disagreement with you that we have multiple conflicting primal instincts. To me, the only thing that I agree with John Stuart Mill on the point that the only thing that is actually desired in itself, and that's not to say it's desirable. We're not in the ought category yet. I'm just talking about in terms of psychological facts.
Yeah, whatever we call it.
The only thing that's actually desired by people in itself is pleasure. So when you say you desire to survive,
Yes.
I think what you really mean is you desire the pleasure that you get from continuing to survive. You don't desire a meal.
No.
You desire the pleasure that will result from eating that meal.
Yeah.
And when you break it down, everything can be broken down to pleasure at the very basis. And pleasure might also be sort of worded as well-being. I think that people such as yourself and Sam Harris have used well-being in the same way that someone like Mill used pleasure. I think pleasure is a slightly more useful term, but even someone like Harris would characterize well-being essentially in terms of pleasure and pain as a psychological state of the brain. So
before we go down that rabbit hole, because I think that's a very interesting place to go, and I think you might be right. This is one of the things that my mind's been altered on slightly as of late. Does that mean that you tend to agree with me when I'm talking about morality, as previously stated, that there are people born with certain preferences? Preference is a bad word. I've got to stop using it. They're born with certain...
I think preference is fine. No, preference is actually preference is probably one of the best words. In fact,
you see, the problem for me is that people think of preference and they think of just opinion. It's more than an opinion.
That's people's problem. Like in the philosophical literature, as far as I understand it, preference just, if you have a preference, it just implies a recognition of pleasure and pain. Like that's essentially the same thing, because and when you see that as a definitional issue, it becomes a tautology to say that the only thing that's desired is pleasure, because essentially pleasure is just whatever you prefer to do.
Yes.
So you are born with preferences, but you're not so much born with preferences as you're born with just the preference towards pleasure.
Yeah.
If you see what I'm saying. So I think that when you talk about competing desires at the basis and competing impulses at the basis of human nature, it's like, yeah, they're all there, but they can all be broken down even further to pleasure. The desire to survive, the desire to eat, the desire to look after your children ultimately can be broken down to pleasure.
So one more time before we get to that, because I think it's a really good point that we should. Is your thoughts on morality on the same lines of mine, where you would say that it's objective in the sense that I say it is?
It's. I agree with you that we do have that desire, but built into us as a human species. I don't know if I'd like to use the word objective.
So here's how I would use it, and maybe you can tell me how I'd use it, how you wouldn't use it.
Okay.
So I'd say it is objectively the case that we are just born with these desires.
Yeah, I agree with
that. It's verifiable. It's a scientific fact. Get over it.
That's
just
not
the
a
case.
problem. Yeah.
And it is objectively the case that there are right and wrong ways to achieve what those desires are trying to achieve.
Yes.
And you can then say, okay, so you have this desire, here's an is, here's an is, here's an is, and there is an outcome, so you can say you ought to do it given this. Or you could not use the word ought because it is loaded. You could use another word.
But not quite. It's
not
like
quite, okay.
I agree with you up to a point. I agree with you, and in fact, these points are crucial to my own ethical framework.
Sure.
Which are firstly that you have a natural and undeniable desire for pleasure. Secondly, that there are facts to be known about the right and wrong way to maximize pleasure. Like there is a conceivable method by which we can maximize a person's pleasure, and that's just a matter of fact. Like there are just better ways than others to maximize pleasure. What doesn't follow for me, and this is the important premise, and this is what we've discussed privately, and we spent a lot of time talking about this, is that I can say it is the case that I desire X. It is the case that the best way to achieve X is Y. It doesn't follow that I should do Y.
No.
Because you still need that premise.
Because when you say should, you're using ought in the same sense that Hume did. What I made clear in my video is that I really don't think words like should and ought mean... What I think they mean is that they are descriptive. I mean, saying that you ought to do something is like saying that this would be good given that you have this preference or given that you have this desire. That's all I see ought to be. So really it's more descriptive, whereas the way you just described it is getting an ought from an is. And I would agree with you. I'd say, no, you can't do that.
Okay.
But I don't think that's necessary to do in order to, function and be able to live in a world where you go, listen, you're wrong to do this or you're right to do this.
So you're kind of going for a redefinition of ought to just mean something descriptive.
Or just, so basically the way I came to this thinking is that I started looking at moral terms and trying to think, what do these things mean absent the rubric of religion?
Sure.
And I did my best to tap into what philosophers had spoken about. And I also did a fair amount of my own thinking. And to me, words like should and ought, they are just descriptive. They just describe whether or not you're getting towards a goal that you have or not, or something will get you towards your goal or not. So for me, when I was using the word ought, I felt like that. I explained it at the beginning of my video exactly how I'm using the word, and that's why I said axiomatic oughts, etc. And in hindsight, I think that was a bit of a blunder, because even with yourself here, and even with you knowing my views, where we've just ended up just 2 minutes ago before my ramblings now, is with you saying, I don't think you can get an ought from an is, which tells me that I'm just using the wrong language or I'm failing to articulate myself. So,
well, I think we just have to be careful with using words like ought in ways that people wouldn't traditionally use them.
Yeah.
It's much in the same way that we feel that people like compatibilists use the word free will in a sense that doesn't really mean free will. Like that's not what people are talking about. Like,
well, this is where I would have disagreement with you, because when it comes to free will, people have always traditionally meant that you are free to do whatever you want, that you're not some puppet on strings. And so to change that definition is to remove it from the essence. But I don't think that's the case when it comes to ought, because I really genuinely see ought is only describing that you should do something, which is essentially the same thing as tautology in that sense. It's like saying this gets you from A to B and you want to get from A to B, so do it, kind of thing. But that aside, I actually think you're right, and I'm happy to concede that ought was probably and is probably not the right terminology for me to use.
Just because the thing is, like, I actually advocate an ethical framework, which we'll jump into in a second.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I advocate an ethical framework which essentially says that we should keep using words like ought and should, but just think about them differently. I'm essentially arguing for a redefinition of these terms. So there's not necessarily a problem with doing that, but I think we just need to be absolutely clear by what we mean by ought. And I think it's fair to say that most people, traditionally speaking, when they have a should or an ought, it means something more than just the achievement of a goal.
It does, but on the point of redefining things and being very clear, the first 5 minutes of my video is me being very clear about how I'm using the term, and it didn't do anything. Right. That makes me think several things, but one of them is that this is just very much ingrained as a concept that is it's not malleable. Okay. In that sense, language has this kind of way. Maybe there is room to do it, and I'm really interested to hear on the specific way that you would use it in your framework.
Okay, so then tell me what you think of this
Sure.
as a definition of the word ought. When I say you ought to do this, what I mean is if you could see things the way I saw them, you would do this.
So that's like saying if you had my preferences.
Not if you had my preferences, just if you, even like if you understood my view of what your preferences are. Like if you knew the same facts or believed the same facts as I did about my own preferences, but also about your preferences, then you would do this.
I think by saying if you believe the same things as me, or believe the same facts, you kind of are saying if you had my preference, you would do this.
Not necessarily.
Because I think that when you want to tell somebody what they ought to do, you necessarily need to know their state of mind. And their state of mind may not correlate with yours. And it could be because they have incorrect facts, but it could also be that they have incorrect impulses, not incorrect pulses, different impulses.
Well, let me give you an example then.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
like, using your sort of goal view of morality, like striving towards a goal, the kind of teleological way of thinking about it. If somebody is about to go on a car journey and there are two routes they can take, and they look at their map and they see that the fastest route is route A rather than route B, but you know that their map is outdated and that there's actually roadworks happening, and they'd be faster going on route B. So you tell them you should use route B instead of route A, and they say no, I trust this map. I'm going to go the route A, and you say but there are roadworks, and they're like, look, I just don't believe you. I trust my map. I'm going with the map. It's route A. You there saying you should use route B is essentially you saying, look, if you believed the things I believed, then you would use route B. That's not to say if you have the same preferences as me. That's just to say if you understood the world as I understand it, you would use route B.
So in that scenario, you have someone that has the preference of getting from A to B.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is that that's their preference. That's what I would call an ought. They ought to get from A to B. But you can say it's their preference it's their goal to get from A to B, right?
Well, let's say start to finish, because I'm using A and B as the kind of routes to get there. So
okay,
route
sure.
A and route B.
They want to get from the start to finish. They want to get from Portsmouth to Oxford.
Yeah.
You know? And what you're saying is that they have planned their journey on facts that they think are facts, but it's not true. So they have planned their journey on basically non-information. So they have an is statement, a factual statement that's wrong. So you're saying that if they knew, when you say if they knew what I knew, they would change their mind. All I see that as saying is that they're just wrong with their is statement. If their is statement was this, which is, as far as you're concerned, correct, they would do what you do, but it's still predicated on them wanting to get from Portsmouth to Oxford.
But okay, so let's complicate it then. Let's say that by some weird feat, turns out they're actually right. Unbeknownst to you, the roadworks has stopped and their map is entirely reliable. Now, you would still be stood there saying you ought to take road B. You'd be wrong.
Yeah.
But you'd still be there saying you ought to take B. And what you mean by that is not if you knew the facts of the world, you would go route B, because that's not the case. Because if they knew the facts of the world, then they would still go route A. What you're saying is if you could see the world as I saw it, if you could believe the things about the world that I believe, then you would act in this way. You could be right or wrong about that, but that's not what matters. What you're saying when you should do this is like, if you could see it, if you could understand the world in the same way as I'm understanding it right now, if you could believe the same natural facts that I believe right now, then you would take route B.
Yeah, so slightly confused on that stance in the sense of it's when people speak about facts, which is what that essentially is, they are is statements. You know, it is the case that this is the best route you should take. It is the case that that is the best route you should take. People state them as facts. They don't state them as I believe this because of X, Y, and Z. They say it is the case that the Earth is a sphere. It is the case that the Earth is flat. They don't say if you saw the documentary that I saw, you would believe that the Earth is flat. They say it is the case that it's flat. You're wrong. Your information's incorrect. So I'm just wondering how that fits into your framework.
I'm looking at should as a sort of separate category of thought, which is to say that traditionally speaking, people have seen should as something that kind of transcends is statements. And I'm saying that we can understand should to simply mean something akin to, look, if you agreed with me right now, you would do this. It keeps it in the realm of is. It's fairly trivial to say, like, you know,
perhaps the best
obviously
way...
if you agreed with me, then you would agree with me and you would feel as though you should do this. But instead of saying like, if you agreed with me, then you believe you should do this, I'm saying if you agreed with me, then you would do this, because you will act upon that impulse, because if you're sort of seeing shoulds as an impulse, as a kind of desire. What I'm saying is should essentially means if you could see things the way that I saw them, then you would do this, because I know that you and that doesn't necessarily mean you'd have the same desires as me. It means like, I believe that the best way to act in accordance with your desires is to do this. Is to like use route B. The best way in accordance with your desires is to use route B. So you should use route B. Right. Like, I mean, if you could see it the way I saw it, you'd use route B. That doesn't mean if you had my preferences. That means if you could understand the way that I'm viewing your preferences.
But they would necessarily... Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
But I think it's a fairly trivial definition, and I think that you could use those things interchangeably. It's like if I say, you know, oh, you really shouldn't be late to work today. It's like, look, if you could see things the way I'm seeing them right now, if you knew our boss, if you knew what the consequences were going to be like I do, then you just would not be late for work. I think that's what we kind of mean when we say should. Now,
It can be.
if it's not, then that's the next point. Is like, I think it should be. And there's a reason for this, which is because I think that is the most helpful way to construct a theory of ethics and keep it in the realm of ises. Because you'll notice that if we define ought and should as if you could see things the way I saw them, then you would do this. It becomes, which is the same thing as you're essentially striving for, a descriptive statement. Yeah. And if we can turn oughts into descriptive is statements, then we can get an ought from an is, because the ought is just an is, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think it's, at the very least, useful to try and find a way of doing that. The question is, are we justified in doing so?
It is a good question, and it'll be interesting to see exactly where you go with this definition that you're working with. The way that gels with the way in which I've previously described things is how I would call something an axiomatic ought, I would think, which is to just say that what I'm saying, as I said, you're not born with a blank slate. It is objectively, verifiably a fact that you're born with a psychological predisposition. That's a fact. That's an is statement, which contains the should, because it's an is statement about the should.
So that's what an axiomatic ought is. It's a desire that you have instilled within you as a matter of fact, that you sort of didn't control or reason your way into. That's for you what an axiomatic ought is.
But something I'd like to just take us back to, if you will, is you were saying that you think that there's only one.
Yeah, that's where I was about to take it. Yeah,
cool.
So I was going to say, if that is how you're defining an axiomatic ought, then I would say that there is only one axiomatic ought, and that is pleasure. That you ought to seek pleasure, and by pleasure I also mean the avoidance of pain. Yeah.
So if I recall correctly, I gave one example in my video, was it, or did I give two?
It's going back a bit now. I think
it is. Yeah.
I may have just responded to one, but I remember an example you gave was, for instance, the ought that your children should survive.
Yeah, that really comes down to pleasure. You can break that down, right? And it does all come down to pleasure.
And to be clear, we're not talking about the child's pleasure there. We're talking about the parent's pleasure.
Yes, there's maybe something to be concerned about or addressed when it comes to the fact that we are a social species, and the fact, basically in reference to Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, we're not really completely, lonely ships in the sea. We really are we're connected. It's all about gene survival.
Yeah, and this will be crucial shortly.
And it is important. But as far as breaking it down to one thing, yes, it really is just all down to pleasure. Okay. And I find that no matter who you talk to on the topic of morality, no matter where they're coming from, be them religious, as I was saying earlier, or whether them being secular, although there's a significant amount of the secular population that just believes it's just a cultural construct, which drives me nuts. I think it's sad. Whoever you take who's arguing for some kind of objective morality, you can break them down, and you will always get down to this pleasure-pain dynamic. You take the Christian down, you go, well, why should we obey God? Because you'll go to hell forever. Why should I care about that? Because suffering sucks. It's like, okay, you've just went all the way back down to pleasure and pain. You're just wrong about your is statement, which is that a God exists and it's going to punish you for using the brain that it apparently gave you.
I mean, what about there are different religious views on morality. Like you could take something like natural law theory or something, which sort of says that ought just means to act in accordance with your nature as a human being, which is kind of defined by God. So it's not the reason that you should do what God commands isn't because you'll be punished for it. It's because what God dictates is correct. You will be punished as a result, but that's not why.
What I would say is, why do you care about being correct?
Interesting, yeah, because essentially,
you're going to get them down to pain and pleasure.
You'll still break them down to pleasure. So whichever route you take, ultimately, the axiomatic desire, rather than
you'll find that no matter who you talk to, if they're pleasure. Honest and they will go down that rabbit hole with you, it will get to this axiom.
Right.
And I think it's fair, as you said, to call it one axiom rather than there are axiomatic oughts. No, there's just an axiom. Really.
Okay, so we get to an interesting and important conclusion here when it comes to ethics, which is where I think we can basically meet in the middle and say that we essentially agree. Maybe we will disagree with our linguistics or the way that we decide to frame it or contextualize it or the way we describe it or which words we use.
Yeah.
But conceptually, I think we can agree here. If we both agree that the only thing that is ultimately desired at the very basic level is pleasure, and every other desire that you can possibly have ultimately breaks down to pleasure. And for the audience listening, it's worth noting that there are common objections to this. For instance, someone might say, well, it's possible to desire things that aren't pleasurable. So, for instance, you can...
you want to get hit during sex.
Yeah, okay, so that's one way. People often say, like, what about sadomasochism? It's like the way that we're defining pleasure is almost... like I said earlier, it's kind of like a tautology. It's like pleasure is... Derek Parfit essentially defined it by saying it is essentially what is wanted when experienced. By definition, that's what
like
pleasure is.
if you talk to the people that are getting hit,
yeah,
they will probably tell you that they are getting more pleasure out of that.
I mean, a
pain.
sadomasochist is basically defined as someone who takes pleasure from things that other people would generally consider to be painful. So that's not a good objection. Another objection might be you can desire things that actually aren't pleasurable. For instance, you take someone who like desires to throw himself on a grenade to save his squad, like the soldier.
Yes.
And that's an important question because it's like, if he's acting in accordance with that desire there, like surely desiring to throw himself on a grenade, like that's not pleasurable. No. And the answer to that is, well, firstly, he could be wrong. He could think that that's going to maximize his pleasure and it not actually do so. But secondly, like the way that his brain could be thinking is, like as Aristotle had it, an intense, short pleasure over kind of a stretched out, lesser pleasure. And
I think the real strong thing to emphasize there is Richard Dawkins' selfish gene as well.
Yeah.
You know, like when a bee stings and it kills itself in the process, people who don't really understand evolution will look at that and go, wow, that seems odd. It's like, no, it makes perfect sense.
But, you know, I'm because it makes sense at the level of the genetics. Like the selfish gene essentially says that we do things that at the level of the organism seem quite selfless, but at the level of the gene are selfish. But I'm talking at the level of the organism here, because I'm talking psychologically we desire pleasure.
I don't think you can talk about the level of an organism without actually talking about the level of the species.
I think when you're talking about pleasure, because what I'm essentially saying is like we desire pleasure or things that are pleasurable, let's say. Although, no, you don't desire things that are pleasurable. You desire those things to get the pleasure. So you do desire pleasure. That's at the level of the organism. Like the gene doesn't have desires in that same philosophical sense.
Sure.
So when the soldier jumps on the grenade, you can explain that evolutionarily in terms of the selfish gene or the expanding circle, as Peter Singer has it. But I think that you can also describe it at the level of the psychology of the organism by saying, for instance, I said that pleasure is also the avoidance of pain. Well, guilt is a pain, as we're defining it. It's a pain, it's a discomfort. And if that soldier has been trained in such a way that he knows he'll live the rest of his life in complete guilt if he didn't sacrifice himself, then in order to avoid that pain, the maximization of the pleasure would be throw himself on the grenade. Now, the important point to note is that he could be totally wrong. That could be totally irrational. Like the guilt would never actually outweigh the pain of throwing yourself on the grenade.
He could be wrong. Yeah.
However, he still desires the pleasure, even if he's got the wrong means to achieve it. Like he's still going in with the desire for pleasure.
Yeah.
So you'll always break down to whether you want to call it well-being or pleasure, which essentially mean the same thing in this discussion.
I do agree with you on that point, but I will just want to add that consider all species, while the bee, for example, I don't know whether or not it experiences any pleasure, and whatever pleasure it does experience, what I want to point out is that its psychological disposition when it's born is completely controlled by its genes. And so the genes do actually play a role. It's just oblique.
Yeah, they play a role, but the gene doesn't do the desiring in the sense that we're interested in.
No, but it does wire it from the outset.
It does. Okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. That's an important thing to add. But okay, so the reason that I think it's important to press this is because, to me, without kind of necessarily realizing it right now, we've got two important premises that are hanging in the air that if we just trivially put together, we've got an objective theory of ethics.
Give it to me.
So one of the premises is this idea that the only thing that you can desire ultimately is the maximization of your pleasure.
I don't know if it's your pleasure, but it is pleasure. Like, this is where the selfish gene plays a big role.
I think it has to be your pleasure. So when you say like
your pleasure,
when you say you want to maximize everyone's pleasure, like again, that could be true.
Not necessarily everyone's, your tribe's.
Or someone else's. Yeah. Let's just say someone else's in any sense of the word. Like, yeah, that can be true, but only true in the sense that as a derivative of that, the reason you desire someone else's pleasure is because of your own pleasure.
Okay, yes.
Because
I see what you're saying.
again, the gene, as you've rightly pointed out there, the gene could have wired you to be irrational. Like, it might not actually be in my interest to make sure that you are like hydrated if I offer you a glass of water. Like, that might not actually be in my interest.
From a selfish point of view, it isn't.
Yeah, but my genes have wired me to believe that it is.
Yeah,
and
so you can be wrong on that. But does that mean you're wrong? Because if your desires are not aligned to what you think maybe they should be aligned to, which is your survival, but they're actually aligned to survival of your tribe or your species, then that's just the facts.
Well, what's happened here then is that you've got a situation where even if the reason why we've developed pleasures is for our survival, and even if it's wrong in the sense that my pleasures aren't actually conducive to survival, they're like a byproduct.
Or to your personal survival,
it's still a fact that the reason why I care about you having the pleasure of being hydrated when I have you a glass of water is because your hydration, which is a pleasure, brings me pleasure or avoids my pain.
That is still true.
And that is actually true. Like, now it might be misguided in the sense that evolutionarily that's not good for me, or let's say that's not conducive.
Good for
that's not conducive to evolutionary development. I want to avoid like good or bad.
So I'd say it is conducive to evolutionary development.
But I'm saying it doesn't matter whether it is or isn't. What is a fact, and we can know, is that the reason I care about your pleasure is because I derive my own pleasure from that.
Yeah, that's premise one. That's a fact.
So ultimately, we desire our own pleasure.
Yeah,
and that's the only thing that's desired in itself.
Yeah.
Now, premise 2, we haven't discussed yet, and I hope the audience doesn't get too annoyed if I suddenly bring this up. But it's the free will premise.
Sure.
Now, free will is something we've never disagreed on. Like, we're both on the same page here. To anybody who's listening or watching, if you're really genuinely unfamiliar with our views on free will, we've both made videos on it. I made a video called something like "Why You Don't Have Free Will." You made "Free Will Debunked," I think it's called.
I did.
You can go and watch "Why We Don't Believe in Free Will," and it's important to understand the context in which we're talking about it. The essential rundown: I'll give you the argument. It will take a few seconds, and if you disagree with any of the premises, then go and listen to these arguments. The premises are this: you will only ever do anything in your life because you desire to do so. Now, you might say, no, like I don't desire to go to the gym, but I still go to the gym. Well, the only reason you do that is because you desire to be healthy. And the desire to be healthy outweighs your desire to stay in bed. Why is that the case? It just is. You don't get to choose that, right? So whatever you do because of some kind of desire. Even when you appear to do something that's undesirable, it's because there's another desire that's stronger that's forcing you to do it, essentially. So you only do what you want because you desire to do so. Desire motivates action. That's a trivial point. What you desire to do motivates your action. Premise 2 is you don't get to choose your desires. You don't control your desires. And if you don't control your desires, but your desires control your actions, then you don't control your actions. Now, again, if you want a further, if you want a deeper dive on that, then watch our videos on the subject, and leave a like and comment and subscribe. But we're on the same page here, so we'll just discuss this as though that's kind of a given. So here's how they go together, and this is what I found really interesting, is that if it's the case that whatever you do, you can only do because you desire it, which is the free will argument. You'll only ever do what you desire, and you're not in control of your desires. Yeah. But it's also the case that the only thing that you can actually desire ultimately is the maximization of pleasure.
Yes.
And any time you do anything, it necessarily and logically follows that you must believe that what you are doing will maximize your pleasure.
So give that one more time.
Mm-hmm. So if it's the case that you will only ever act in accordance with your desires,
sure, which is the free will
argument
situation,
you'll only ever act in accordance with your desires. Mm-hmm. But we also know that the only thing that you can desire is the maximization of pleasure. Mm-hmm. Then that means anytime you do anything, you must believe it will maximize your pleasure. Because you have to act in accordance with your desires.
And you can be right and wrong about that.
You can be right or wrong about that.
Yeah.
But what we know is that anytime you do anything ever, you must necessarily believe that doing that will maximize your pleasure, because you're only doing it because you desire it. That's the free will argument. And the only thing you desire is the maximization of your pleasure. Yeah. So you have to believe that doing this will actually maximize your pleasure.
Yeah, I see no issue with that, yeah.
again, if people
Not the current, anyway.
if people have an issue with this, or we're going a bit fast here, like I actually recently gave a talk to Dorset humanists. I believe by the time this podcast goes out, that video will be online. It will be called The Good Delusion. It's a talk that I gave, and it basically just completely breaks this argument down. So you can go and watch that if you want to see an even deeper discussion. But essentially, because it seems that like you seem to have no problems with this. Some people have a bit of a problem or seeing it kind of in the wrong context. But I think it makes perfect sense to say if free will doesn't exist, and therefore and that's because you act in accordance with your desires. And we've just agreed that the only thing that's possible to desire is pleasure. Then that means
and just add to that, whether your desires are determined or random, neither of which give you free will, and that's important to stress. But
But so whenever you act in accordance with your desires, and your desires are for pleasure, you know that whatever you act, whatever you do, it's because you think it will maximize your pleasure. Like that just logically follows. Yeah. So now we've got an interesting situation, which is this. If you do action X, I know necessarily that you believe that doing X will maximize your pleasure. You're either right or wrong about that.
Yeah.
You're either correct or incorrect that will maximize your pleasure. That's something also that we agreed on earlier today. Yeah. And you'll see how this is very similar to the moral view that you were espousing, why I essentially say that I pretty much agree with you now, but use different language. So if you are wrong, and it's not the case that doing X will actually maximize your pleasure, then that's because you believe something that's incorrect. You believe a false piece of information about the natural world. You believe something wrong. Yeah. But the only way to correct that belief would be in such a way that would make you act differently. Because if you discovered that doing X won't maximize your pleasure, or you became convinced, it doesn't even need to be right, you don't need to be correct. Like if you just became convinced or believed that doing X isn't going to maximize your pleasure, doing Y is going to maximize your pleasure, then because you act in accordance with your desires and you desire pleasure, you will necessarily do Y. Yeah. You will have to do Y.
Yeah.
So when you do X, I can say that indicates necessarily a belief you hold about X that is right or wrong, and right or wrong in such a way that could only be rectified if you acted differently. Now, I'm not saying that X is wrong. I'm not saying that doing X is wrong. What I'm saying is that doing X indicates necessarily a belief that you hold that is wrong in such a way that can only be rectified in a way that would make you act differently.
So what would be an example?
So as an example, let's say you shoplifted.
Sure.
So you just tried to shoplift something. That necessarily means, because of the free will argument, you only act in accordance with your desires and you only desire pleasure. You shoplifting was in accordance with the desire for pleasure. So you think that shoplifting will bring you pleasure. You think that shoplifting is the way to maximize your pleasure in that instance. Now, I would argue perhaps that you are wrong about that. And actually, the way to maximize your pleasure is to not shoplift. Now, one of us is right there. Like one of us is correct. It's either the case that shoplifting maximizes your pleasure, or it's the case that it doesn't.
Yes.
So if you're wrong, and again I stress that's no ought statement there. That's just an is statement.
It's just factual.
Facts about the brain.
It's facts that we make in all sorts of statements of science.
Exactly. If you're wrong, if shoplifting would not actually maximize your pleasure, then the only way you could actually rectify that belief, the only way that you could become right, is to believe that shoplifting will not maximize your pleasure.
Yeah.
And if you believed that shoplifting wouldn't maximize your pleasure, then you necessarily wouldn't do it. That's the free will argument. Yeah. So by saying, like, when you shoplift, I can say, your action there, your shoplifting, indicates to me necessarily, it logically follows, that you hold a belief about the natural world, an is statement, which is wrong. And it's wrong in such a way that the only way you could become right is in a way that would cause you to act differently.
Yes.
So you're wrong in a way that can only be rectified if you act differently. I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong and to correct yourself, act differently. I'm saying that what you're doing indicates wrongness, and to become right, it would follow that you would act differently.
Would it be fair to say that you're saying what they're doing is wrong because their facts are incorrect?
No, what they're doing is not wrong. This is the important thing.
Or would it be fair to say that what they are doing, their actions, are not conducive to their goal? And the reason because it's not conducive is because their factual statements are incorrect.
Yeah, so that's right, and that's essentially where we would find agreement. But the important point to note and the important point to add is that I can say that doing that shoplifting isn't conducive to your goal, but I can also say like I know what your goal is, and I know that if you became convinced that doing this isn't conducive to your goal, you would act differently, like as a matter of fact, as necessity, because there's no free will, and we can perfectly agree on that because we both agree with the free will argument.
And again, if you don't, then you're going to have to.
Yeah, you can watch those videos.
Yeah.
But it just becomes the case that we have kind of fell into an agent-based ethical theory, because, like I say, I still can't say that an action is wrong, but I can say that an action indicates a belief that you hold as an agent that is right or wrong. And if you're wrong, the only way you can become right is if you acted differently. And if you're right, the only way you can become wrong is if you acted differently. Yeah. But it's not the act that's right or wrong. It's you and your beliefs that are right or wrong. And the act simply indicates which beliefs you hold. Because the beliefs are what cause the act, right? But look, this is practically indistinguishable from ethics. Like if I said to you...
It is, yeah.
If I said to you, shoplifting is wrong... in order to become right, you should not shoplift. That's essentially no different from me saying shoplifting indicates that you're wrong, and the only way to become right is
like saying
in such a way that you would
murder is wrong.
Yeah,
it's not wrong.
Now,
I know that sounds mental, but this is what we're talking about.
It's not murder isn't wrong, but murder
it's
indicates
wrong for you to murder.
The act of murder indicates a belief that you hold that is wrong.
Exactly.
That can only become right in such a way that would cause you not to murder.
Yeah.
Now, this is important because remember the definition of should I came up with earlier, and you'll see why I like this definition now, because should, in my book, simply means if you saw things the way I saw them, you wouldn't do this, or you would do this. Should, shouldn't, or should. So when I say you shouldn't shoplift, I mean if you could see things the way that I saw them, you wouldn't shoplift. What I mean by that is if you could believe the same things I believe, which is that shoplifting will not maximize your pleasure, then you would not do it. And I know you wouldn't do it because you have to act in accordance with what you think will maximize your pleasure. Do you see what I'm saying there?
I do see what you're saying. And what I can say is that I agree. And I think that the free will argument, the deterministic argument, if you will, just makes it stronger. I'm not necessarily sure if it's needed to make the point, but in any case, I'm certainly not against it.
I think it is, and I'll tell you why. The reason I think it is because the free will argument is essentially that you will act in accordance with your desires and nothing else. If it's the case that that is false, that you can act out of accordance with your desires, then who cares if you desire pleasure? Who cares if you have an axiomatic desire towards doing a certain thing? Like, you don't have to act in accordance with that.
No, but who cares if you had free will with it anyway? It's like, okay, you have preferences, you have goals. You don't have to act. In one case, you act towards it. In one case, you don't.
Right, but no one cares. That's the difference. Like, if you don't have free will, then it is the case that actually, if you have this axiomatic desire, then you have to act in accordance with it.
Or you just will.
Yeah,
you will.
That's what I mean by have.
But in a world where free will exists, you might not do it.
Exactly.
But in any case, the situation is still the same. Well, you have a goal. And there are right and wrong ways to achieve that goal.
Right, but when you have free will, like, your action is not indicative of a belief that you hold necessarily.
No, that's true.
So if there's no free will because of the desire argument, then I can say that when you shoplift, I know like that is necessarily indicative of a belief that you hold that's either right or wrong. If free will does exist, then you can't say that. You can't say that you shoplifting indicates a belief you hold. It can be completely detached from the belief that you hold there.
Sure.
Now, the only way for this ethical argument to work is for me to say, like, your action indicates that you're doing something wrong, that you believe something wrong, that can only be corrected in a way that would make you act differently. If you remove the element of saying that the action indicates a belief that can be right or wrong, then you can't make that next step, which is to say that to rectify your right or wrong belief, you'd have to act differently.
I think you can, but it's not you're not rectifying the belief per se. You're rectifying you're correcting them on facts that they have that's wrong. So here's the scenario. If I can paint it the way I'm looking at it, and then you tell me how you're looking at it, and then we can see where that's going wrong, or where we're disagreeing. You have somebody that's shoplifting, and this person's shoplifting because he believes that the best way for him to feed his family is to steal. And I'm looking by on the side, and I'm saying that's not the best way to feed your family. I understand that your goal, your ought, if you will, stay with goal. Your goal is to feed your family.
But importantly, and I don't mean to interrupt, but like we just agreed earlier, the goal isn't to feed the family. You can break that down.
You can break it down.
The goal is still pleasure.
But still, in this context, it manifests as that. Like that's the step that he's taking to fulfill his own pleasure.
But who cares?
But the way, I don't think care matters.
Like who cares if his goal is to maximize his pleasure by feeding his family? Like my point, he doesn't have to act in accordance with that.
Who cares if he has free will or not in this situation? The fact's still the same. This person wants ultimately to increase his own pleasure, but how that manifests at this particular time is that he thinks to fulfill my own pleasure. He may even not think this consciously. It may be unconsciously, but to him it's, I need to feed my family. And he thinks the best way to achieve that is by stealing food. I don't see how free will and not having free will changes that scenario whatsoever. Because if you follow it through, I would say that the result's the same. And that is me coming up to him or someone else coming up to him and saying, listen, you're wrong about the is statement, which is, this is the best way for me to feed my family, stealing it. You can say, no, you're better. It is the case that if you work for it, you'll feed your family, and you won't necessarily have repercussions of going to prison, where you're not even going to be able to feed your family for maybe months. It could be years, depending on the seriousness and the context of wherever he's stealing from. In that case, you're still saying, it doesn't matter if he has free will or not. You're just saying that you're operating under that assumption, just saying he's wrong. His facts are wrong.
The reason it matters for me is because, like, you've essentially just made the free will argument, which is that, look, if you feel that the best way to achieve your goal is to feed your family, then you will feel, I need to feed my family. That's what you just said. Well, that is the free will argument, which is that if you think, if you have this goal, and that goal is pleasure, as we've already agreed, like whatever goal you have, it's ultimately broken down to pleasure. So this man has this goal, and you say, if he thinks the best way to achieve that goal is to feed his family, then he'll feel like he needs to do it. Well, yeah, that means he has no free will. That is the free will argument, which is that if he believes that this is the way to achieve a goal,
but I don't necessarily
desire, then he must do that.
I don't think that part is necessary, because you're right, and I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that whether or not that person has free will is irrelevant to me saying that if that is that person's goal, then that is not the best way to achieve it. That is the best way to achieve it, given this circumstance, given this situation. So it's the cunt situation there.
Yeah, but what you can't say is that, let's take this guy.
I can't say he will act that way. I can just say you do what you want with that information. But here I've corrected you.
But that's the problem, right? So you can just say, like, that's not the best way to maximize this goal, and he could just be like, well, I disagree with you. Like, so what? Like, or even if I agree with you, like, so what? Like, it doesn't make a difference. The only reason why it would make a difference to someone.
No, I don't agree with that. Why wouldn't that make a difference?
Because the only reason that it would make a difference to say to someone, if you say to someone, actually, the best way to maximize your goal that you're trying to achieve is to do this instead. The only way that would mean something to someone is if that was enough to compel them to act differently. And if that is enough to compel
whether
them to
they have free will or not, and I agree that they don't.
No, but
in any case, that will still compel them. It's just that they may not act on it.
No, but I mean compel as in make them do it.
In the case where they have free will, what would happen is I would show this individual that this is a better way in which to achieve his goal.
Okay.
Yeah. And I would go, there you go. I've removed an is statement from your premise that was incorrect, and I've given you an is premise that is correct.
Yeah.
And let's just say, hypothetically, it is the case that that is the best way for him to achieve his goal of feeding his family, which in turn means that he increases his own pleasure. Now, in a scenario where he doesn't have free will, which we agree that is the case, he will necessarily act towards what information I gave him, and he would try and get a job, and he'd do it that way. But in a scenario where he doesn't have free will, the situation is still objectively the case. This is what I mean by the objective point in morality. It is objectively the case that that is what is best for him to achieve his goal. It's what he should do, ought to do. But he may say, I don't want to act on that, because that's where this free will component comes in. Okay, fine. It doesn't change the fact that that's still objectively the case.
Yeah.
That is why I would say, at the present, that I don't see, although I agree with you, I don't see it. I'd prefer to get people through this first hurdle than make them go through both hurdles at once, because it pains me to watch otherwise very educated and talented people that are on my side, they're secularists, they're non-religious, just so easily dismiss depravities, egregious acts, because they believe that morality is just a cultural construct, that it doesn't reduce down to well-being. For me, it's so important to get them past that first hurdle that I don't think that we necessarily need to attach the free will component, that I just want to get people past that hurdle. I just want people to go, crap, I was thinking about this wrong. And yes, it is wrong to, the example that Sam Harris gives, throw battery acid into the face of little girls for the crime of trying to read. That's it's to me.
It's tricky, right? Because I agree with you that it's important to jump this hurdle rather than throw everything at everyone at once. But firstly, it's worth noting that I think that the concept of free will is kind of conceptually incoherent. So I don't even think it makes sense to kind of imagine a hypothetical in which a man does have free will, because I don't think it makes sense.
But here's the fact. I let you carry on. But the fact is that while I agree with you, most people believe in free will.
Yep.
So we have to work with that fact.
Well, I still think you do need this free will component, and the reason is because, you can say to somebody, even if they have free will, you can say, look, whatever that means, you can say, look, you have this goal, and you think that the best way to achieve this goal is to do this. Well, you can't even actually say that, because who's to say they're acting in accordance with what they think is the best goal? Like they don't have to be doing that because they have free will.
You have to make the assumption that their actions line up with their preferences.
That is the free will argument.
But that's fine. We do that again with everything. We go, the sun will rise up tomorrow because it was
right. But look, what I mean is like, this is why I don't think it makes sense to even talk about the hypothetical of there being free will, because you're like, well, we have to kind of assume that this person is acting in accordance with their preferences. Well, if you're acting in accordance with your preferences, if you're acting in accordance with your desires, that is the anti-free will argument, that when you act, you're acting in accordance with your desires. The only way to get out of that and to retain this libertarian free will is to say, no, you can act out of accordance with your desires.
Yeah.
But as you're rightly pointing out, like, for us to make any sense of somebody's motives and action and behavior, we have to assume that what they're doing, they believe to be the best course of action in accordance with their desires.
Okay, so we
have to have that anti-free will component. We have to have...
I don't think that's... I think this is the key point. I don't think that's anti-free will. I think the concept of free will is that you can act not according to your desires, not according to these deterministic factors or random chance or whatever it might be. But that doesn't necessarily follow that people won't follow it to the T until that point. So this person has this preference to feed his children, or he has this desire to satisfy himself, and that's the way that it's manifesting in this situation. I see no issue with him having all of that desire and all of his actions, when you look at him, showing that he has that desire, and then him just at the very end he just goes, no, I'm not going to do it anymore. That would be an act of actual free will, if you will, because it could be against his desires, etc. But I don't see how that changes the fact that
Okay.
it's still objectively the case
Yeah.
that that's a stupid mistake.
Okay, so instead of talking about the free will component going sort of into the person's action, let's talk about coming out of it. Like, so remember, my view is that when you act, it is indicative of a belief you hold that if it's wrong, can only be made right in such a way that would make you act differently. So let's talk about that second part,
Okay,
which
sure.
is if there's no free will, the second part is crucial because, like, yeah, I can say that shoplifting is wrong for you, but what does it mean for me to say that it's right to not do that, or that it's right to do something, or it's right to give to charity? What I mean is that if it's wrong to shoplift, then, well, again, I don't think it's wrong to shoplift. I think that shoplifting indicates that you hold a belief that shoplifting will maximize your pleasure, and if you're wrong about that, then if you correct your belief that actually not shoplifting will maximize your pleasure, then you would have to act in accordance with that. There's the free will component.
Yeah.
If there is free will, then you could correct your belief that you hold. You could correct the belief and yet still not act in accordance with it.
Yeah,
So
but you would be wrong.
you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't necessarily. You would be right because you believe the right thing. You believe, like you could be shoplifting, and I could say that indicates that you think that shoplifting maximizes your pleasure.
Yeah.
And I could say, look, actually, here's an argument that shoplifting doesn't maximize your pleasure. And you go, you know what, you're right. And you believe that actually shoplifting will minimize your pleasure. And you just do it anyway.
Yeah, that would mean I was wrong. I don't. How
It doesn't mean. Why does it mean you're wrong? Like, you believe the right thing. Everything you believe, every single is statement that you believe is correct.
Yeah.
Like, you believe that it will minimize your pleasure if you shoplift.
So I'm following you correctly.
You just do it anyway.
Person's got a desire to maximize his pleasure. He's in this situation where he finds at this moment the best way to maximize his pleasure is by stealing food to feed his children.
Yeah.
You come along and you say, listen, this is not the best way to do it. This statement of stealing is bad. What you should do, or what is the case that would get you to your goal, is by taking a job. And he says, you're correct. You have changed my belief. I now recognize that that is the best way for me to achieve my own goal.
Yeah. And then he just doesn't
And
do it.
he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
He's still wrong. It's just all you have there is a free will component
How is he wrong? What's he wrong? What wrong belief does he hold?
He's wrong. No, he's wrong in the sense that that action does not. It's not conducive to his goal.
Yeah, he knows that.
To the point. Yeah, exactly.
So he's not. So what's he wrong about? Like, he knows that.
He's not wrong acting that way. There is no right and wrong about what people do and how they do things like that. It's just that he's wrong in the sense that it doesn't objectively follow that that's the way that he should achieve his goal, or that's the best way to achieve his goal. It follows from another route.
But
This is like when people say
all of
it's
these things. Like, he believes all these things to be true. Like, there is nothing that he believes. There is no belief that he holds in this scenario that is false. So how can you say that? How can you say that he doesn't hold any wrong beliefs?
No. His beliefs aren't wrong.
So what's wrong?
If I said his beliefs,
I don't think you did. That's my inference.
No. His beliefs aren't wrong.
What is wrong then?
His action just isn't. It doesn't. It's not coherent with his goal. That's what I mean by wrong. His beliefs aren't wrong.
Is that all you mean then by because that sort of implies that what you mean when you say you shouldn't do something, or when you say something's wrong, all you literally mean is like, that's not coherent with your goal. That seems like, because I think that makes sense, but it just seems a bit weak. It doesn't have the normative function. So the thing that's missing, and I think the reason why, and I see what you're saying now, which is to say that, because again, this is like a definitional thing, right? So you're literally just defining wrong and shouldn't in terms of achieving a goal.
As I said, it's description towards, is it good towards a goal or bad towards a goal?
So
Does
then
it work for it or against it? Because I really don't think that this is what I was talking about at the beginning with religious words. People say things like, it's wrong to murder. No, it's not. To me, that's like saying gravity is, and then you just give a random number. It's like, no, the Earth's gravity is X. The moon's gravity is Y. So I wouldn't say murder is wrong. I would say you should not murder. Why? Because we can go down to what is pleasurable to you.
Like, you can reword that. You can reword it to say something like, gravity is in relation to mass. And that is true of the Earth, it's true of the sun, it's true of everything.
But that's like saying morality is in relation to
the being.
To beings.
Yeah, I suppose so, but like, that doesn't necessarily.
That's just a statement of fact. But it's just a statement of fact. That's not. I don't see anything.
Okay, and actually, just to take a sort of very brief detour, I want to clear some things up about moral subjectivism. People think that moral subjectivism is something akin to you saying the Earth is the Earth's gravity is 5 meters per second squared, and I say that it's 9.8. No, I think that when I was espousing moral subjectivism in the past, it's not like you think murder's wrong and that's just your opinion. I think murder's right and that's just my opinion. It's like we can be right or wrong about whether or not that is conducive to pleasure. The subjective level is the desirability of pleasure. So the subjectivity doesn't lie at the level of the action; it lies at the level of the desire, which is pleasure. But okay, look, let me.
I agree with that, but we live in a world where people do make such statements. They say killing is wrong. Other people say that homosexuality is wrong. They're just blanket statements. And the reason why it makes sense to them is because they are operating under this religious rubric, these religious definitions, where these things are dictated. It's like a law of the universe by a god or whatever it might be. Absent that, we have to start thinking about things in a different way. I think the shift that we need is essentially what we had from going from astrology to astronomy. We had to throw out a lot of concepts because inherent in those concepts were assumptions that we weren't justified to make.
Yeah.
But do continue.
So, I mean, previously people will have criticized me for saying in a situation where somebody thinks murder is wrong and someone thinks murder is right, as a moral subjectivist, Alex, you just have to kind of accept that that's that person's opinion and that they're right for them and that's right for me. And when you talk about like things being right for a person, people might mistakenly conclude that what you mean is like if someone thinks that murder's right, then, well, that's true for them. Like, no, what we're saying here, I think, is that what's true for them is that the maximization of their pleasure is good. And when they say that murder is right or murder is wrong, like they're either correct or incorrect about that in relation to that goal of pleasure.
And it's normally because they have facts that are incorrect.
Exactly,
Religion is the granddaddy of this. So somebody saying it is the case that I should throw homosexuals from rooftops, that is a case that happens right now in the Middle East. It's a common practice. And the reason they're what I would say to them is that what they're wrong about is the fact that Allah exists, that the Quran is true, and that is what should be done to people who don't have the typical straight sexuality. They're just wrong about that fact. But really what they're trying to do, you ask them, they say, I'm doing a kind act here. Why? Because they do care about kindness. They're just wrong about certain facts.
So when I've previously said that morality is subjective, I don't mean to say that it's subjective at the level of the belief like murder is right or murder is wrong. I mean that it's a subjective desire to maximize your pleasure.
Yeah.
But once you have that desire that we both agree on, I can say that you are right or wrong about that. So when I say to someone like you're wrong, like murder is the wrong thing to be doing, and someone says, but aren't you a moral subjectivist? How can you say that? It's like, because I know that subjectively this person desires pleasure and that doing this isn't going to get them there. Now, let's talk about briefly before we end, because these things usually go on for like an hour and a half. We're
got to have
about an hour 20.
To everyone that's still listening, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for staying with us in the conversation.
Really
I feel like the clarity has kind of improved. Like the beginning of the conversation was kind of jumpy and we were sort of trying to find our feet. But like as we've discussed more, it's really sort of cleared up, and I think we're roughly getting to the same page here. You think that good and bad and should be just defined in terms strictly of achieving goals, in reference to goals. Now, of course, you can do that if you want.
No, it's even more than that. I think that is actually what it is. When you take good and bad outside of the context of morality, that is what they mean.
But the problem...
But we're talking about morality, I understand.
The problem I have with that, and the problem other people would have with that, is that it's a bit too weak. It's like it doesn't have the prescriptive function that morality needs to have. Morality needs to be more... But
when scientists started giving statements about astronomy, people said, it's too weak. You're not telling me why it's doing that. You're just saying how. And it's like, yeah, okay. It doesn't give you what you want from it.
Then you're not doing morality. You're just doing science. Like morality needs... this prescriptive element. It needs more than just the description of goals. It needs the kind of like your actions need to change, and here's why. That's what morality needs.
I would say that whether you want to call what I'm doing morality or not, what is important and what I'm just trying to convey is that it is not subjective in the scientific sense, which is to say based on opinion or cultural circumstances.
Okay.
It is scientifically, objectively verifiable. There is facts to be known about about morality, about our preferences, and there are right and wrong ways to achieve the goals that pretty much everyone has, which is pleasure.
Okay, so
whether you want to call that morality or not doesn't concern me at all.
So if the free will component isn't necessary in your view to this,
but I do
this
think
framework,
it is a powerful addition.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's
agree with that.
Let me try you on that then. Why I think it is not just powerful, but why I think if somebody's looking for, when I think people are looking for ethics, you're happy to sort of say that, well, actually, maybe ethics just is weak. Maybe it is just descriptive. Maybe it is just about goal achievement. I and other people, I think, would be more inclined to say, but I want more than that from ethics. I want there to be something a bit more like ethics needs to be able to tell me, behave like this, or change your behavior, or something like that, or like your behavior is in accordance with rightness or wrongness, like outside of just achieving a goal, but like as some kind of objective circle, like you are completing the circle. It is right for you to act in this way. It needs more, and this is why I think that the free will argument brings more to the table. Because if it's the case that you have to act in accordance with your desires, and you have a false desire that shoplifting will maximize your pleasure, then I can say that by correcting your desire, you must act differently. So the only way,
aren't you just saying you will?
Yeah, you will. You might, and I don't.
You're not, there is no moral part in this. Then you're just saying you will.
There's no ought in the traditional sense, but the reason why the will is important, and the reason why that, and this is the part that you would dispute is necessary, is the ability to say that if you change your belief, if you correct your belief, then you would act differently.
Yeah,
like that's the point under dispute here, and the reason I think it's so important to retain this is because you inject ethics with the ability to say that, in order to correct your belief, you act differently. Like, in order to be right, you act like this. And I don't mean right in accordance with, like, some goal you hold. I mean, like, objectively right, like, correct. I don't mean, in order to achieve this goal in the maximal possible way, do this. I mean, in order to be correct, in order to be objectively right, then you would have to act in this way. That's what the free will argument gives you. It takes you from just saying...
But they will only act in that way, given that they have preferences, given that they have goals, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And only if they have to act in accordance with that preference. And I'm going to say that preference rather than preferences, because the preference is pleasure.
No, sure. I would say that when it comes to the situation at the end, and you have one scenario where there's free will and one where there's not, the difference really boils down to, with the case where they don't have free will, you will say straight up, given this, you will do this. It's just a statement of fact. You will act in this way. Whereas in the scenario where they have free will, which I don't believe they do, but in this scenario where he has free will, you're basically saying that if you want to fulfill whatever goal that you have, whatever your preference, if you want to fulfill your preference, then that is the way to do it. That is objectively, verifiably, scientifically the best way to do it. Whether or not he does it, I just don't personally see it as relevant.
So we're sort of saying different things here, and the reason why, because you're right to point out that I'm not actually getting a should in the traditional sense.
You're just describing facts.
I'm still just describing facts, but I'm doing it in such a way that is that so like the whole sort of conclusion of this, and you need the free will component for this kind of specific incarnation of the argument, which is that if you shoplift, then you are wrong in such a way that can only be corrected if you were to act differently. Because the part that's wrong is the belief you hold. And I know you hold the belief because your beliefs have to influence your action. And I know that if you were to correct that belief, you'd act differently because your beliefs have to motivate that action. That's the free will component. So I can say that you are wrong in a way that can only be corrected if you act differently. That's not ethics. That's not an ought. That's not crossing the is-ought divide. But it's practically indistinguishable, so it's useful.
But I'm not also going from the is-ought, going over the is-ought divide.
I don't think you are.
So, do you? Okay,
no.
cool.
But what you're doing is you're still just describing facts, as am I, but you're not doing it in such a way that you can say, in order to be objectively right, you must do this. All you can say is that in order to objectively achieve your goal, you must do this. But I can say with this framework, in order to be correct, like full stop, in order to be right, in order to have all the things that you believe be correct, you have to act this way. Whereas all you can say is like...
No, but you're not saying you have to. You're saying you will.
Yeah, but that's what I mean by have to. It's like you must, you will, you have to, you have no choice but to do so. Like you will do this.
Yeah.
So
if there's no choice, then people may be listening and thinking, what the hell does this have to do with morality? Morality's always been about choice, no?
Well, what it means is that we've constructed a theory of ethics which not only doesn't require free will, but actually requires the non-existence of free will.
See, what I think that maybe a subsequent conversation at some point, but what I think is that with the component of not having free will, which you've brought up, I think it does make the argument more powerful. I'm just struggling. It might be me being obtuse to see why that is necessary to attach to the primary argument that I've been laying out, because I want to get people past that first hurdle.
Yeah,
and while I think your argument makes it stronger with the free will, lack of free will, I don't think that it's necessary to get to what I want from this, which is a scientific, verifiable, objective morality, and for people to just recognize that that's the case.
Right. Well, for the record, I don't think you're being obtuse, but I think that in order to get what I want from this, in order to get what I think other people want from this, which is just a little bit more than what you're offering.
If I could just add to the little bit more. I think I do appreciate what you're saying.
And just when you say perhaps a subsequent conversation, I think it will have to be one because we'll have to wrap up soon. But
we will. What I would say is that if you do look at these kind of conversations, that this is to everyone listening to what me and you are having, and you find that, let's say that you find what I'm saying to be correct, and you think, okay, that is correct, and there is some element here which really does tether to morality, and I agree with Steve, but Alex is right. I'm in this situation where it just doesn't give me it just doesn't give me what I'm looking for. My answer, honestly, is tough. Get over it. When you first figured out, hopefully, well, if you're an atheist, if you're non-religious, I should say, when you first figured out, oh wow, we're an evolved species and the universe doesn't care about us, lots of people were stuck thinking, that just doesn't give me what I want, which is eternal life, essentially. It's seeing my loved ones again. But the answer is just tough. This is what you have to work with. I think the same is true of this morality case. It's like, listen, you have your cake, you just can't eat it too.
Right. Well, look, I mean, I totally agree with you that if it is just the case that that's as far as you can get, then tough. What I'm saying is, and we both seem to agree here, that with this free will component, it takes you further. So like, you could say, if this isn't sufficient for you, then tough. But what I'm saying is like, yeah, if it weren't sufficient, then tough. But we can make it sufficient really easily by just adding this component to the argument. And that's why I think even if you don't agree that it's necessary in a meta-ethical sense, you can at least agree that it's necessary in the sense that for people to be fulfilled by it, they might have to believe this. And because we both believe that part is true, that's not a problem, because it's just a true addition to this theory. Let's just take these ideas, this meta-ethical construct. Let's add this other thing that we both agree to be true, and we've suddenly got something that is not just like, well, tough, that's what you're getting. It's like, here's a fulfilling ethical framework by which I can say that you're right or wrong in such a way that's indicated by the way that you act. Like, that's a fulfilling ethical theory for me.
What I would say to that is that I'm with you. I agree on both of the premises, if you will. I'm completely in the same box as you, despite the fact that I'm arguing from a slight, mainly for the first premise, if you will. I'm not satisfied by that. I actually find the fact that free will doesn't exist to be incredibly unsatisfying. I find that it sucks satisfaction out of things that I enjoy. But it's just the case. And I would just why would I get over it? Tough.
Yeah.
So for some people, it will be, okay, some people may have this value and get what they want from this, as you described and as you seem to. But I think you'll find that there'll be plenty of people like me that's just, they're either indifferent to it, and so it's just confusing to add it.
Right.
or two, it just doesn't give them what you're claiming it may give them, or what it gives you, perhaps, would be the most accurate way to put it, because it doesn't give it to me. To me, it's just lots of the things I found out from approaching life honestly, from really trying to delve into what's really the case, it's just disappointing. So you look at, you're going to die. Everyone you know is going to die, and they're probably going to die in a suffering way. Cancer, whatnot. It's just a fact. Tough. That's not satisfying. But I prefer that over the illusion, the falseness of what's given to us by religions. When it comes to morality, it's like, yeah, it's not wrong to murder, but it is wrong for everyone or almost everyone to murder because it's not conducive to their preference. Let's say that instead of preferences, of course, because I think you're right on that. That doesn't give me great comfort. It's just a fact, and it's very interesting. But this is just the way life is to me. And people might see that as cynical, but it's honest, and it's humbling, because you deal with life and you go, wow, this universe wasn't created with me in mind, and everything I am learning, everything that I earnestly bring on board is teaching me that so explicitly that sometimes I just want to sink into my biases and disappear, because I'm an ape like everyone else, and that's what we want to do. This is why I'm not so concerned on that element of giving people what they want. I'd rather just go, look, here is the cake, there is the moral framework, it is objective, it's scientifically verifiably objective. And the reason I haven't had such concern for people wanting the more is because, perhaps selfishly or from my own perspective, I don't. It's just the way it is. Life's cruel, life's nasty.
Do you think it's more important to know true things than to have these comforting falsehoods? Like that may be the choice that you've taken and the route that you've preferred, but do you think you can say of everybody that it's worth knowing the truth over sort of blissful ignorance? Like,
I think for individuals, sometimes they are going to suffer from knowing certain truths. But I think that as a whole, when all it takes is one person to be ignorant to cause a lot of harm to a lot of things, and so it's just the price that we have to pay, and that is to know as many true things as possible, because when you don't, you cause other people to suffer. And you need to know these truths, whether or not they bring you the comfort that you're looking for. That's just the way it is to me. And it's unfortunate, but life owes you nothing, and then you're going to die. Right. So I do understand what you're saying about the free will component. I don't mean to end it on a heavier note, but I think it is an important distinction to bring in, because morality is one of the biggest topics that we care about, and to address that concern is pretty important. Reminds me of something that Neil deGrasse Tyson said to Richard Dawkins. He said, do you not think that your way of communicating with people isn't the most effective? In his experience, Tyson's experience, it's to say, here are the facts and here is a sensitivity to your state of mind, and it's only then when you make impact. And Dawkins pretty much quoted a reply where he said, science is interesting, if you don't agree you can fuck off. It's like, depending on where you land on there is how well you're going to be able to digest certain truths, such as morality not giving you what you may have wanted, but it is still objective. And I insist that I just hope that for people, they will figure out that is enough, because it is for me.
So if my listeners have been listening to this entire 1 hour and a half conversation, just waiting and wondering why it is that the tiny little E is next to this particular episode on the Cosmic Skeptic podcast to denote explicit content, we've finally reached it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, look, I think it's worth pointing out that I totally agree with you in everything you're saying. I just think that more can be added, and I think more should be added, if should can mean such a thing. I mean, even should in the sense that I mean it. I think that like more than what you're promoting here as an ethical theory can be added without changing anything that you're saying, but whilst also adding a whole lot more fulfillment and also adding a whole new dimension to the argument, and being able to bring together different areas of philosophy that people often, like, as soon as you make the free will argument, the moral argument comes up, because if there's no free will, how can there be morality? Well, if we can combine these, then we have a really useful system by which to to convince people that you can have an objective ethics. You don't need to worry about free will not existing, and it does all fit together. So don't worry about kind of discrepant philosophical thoughts flying around. But I think the important thing to note is that even if I think we should take it further, I still agree with as far as you've taken it. And even if you don't think that I need to take it further, the steps that I'm using to take it further, you also agree with. So the disagreement is now
a big thing to celebrate.
The disagreement is now not the actual substantive content, but how much of that substantive content is necessary to make a good point.
Well, it's like disagreement I have on free will with, I think I still have it, and I haven't seen much of his content with Matt Dillahunty. It's like we're on the same side. It's just a difference in tactics. And that's pretty much where we seem to be. And I think that is, I want to thank you for making your videos and having these conversations with me. Morality can be a boring subject to many people, and it's a difficult one to, at least for me, it's a difficult one to wrap my head around, or it was. It obviously still is, because I'm still not as articulate as I want to be on the topic. It's just a difficult one. It seems to be difficult for humans in general, and part of that is because of historical reasons. And I think part of it is that it's just we haven't evolved to figure these things out. That's what makes these extra hard. But I do thank you for how you've changed my mind on this subject, because I've went from a position of being not entirely sure but really needing an answer to a position where I have an answer but it may not be all that satisfying.
Yeah, well, likewise, I thank you because, like I said at the very beginning of the video, you've changed the context in which I'm thinking about this. You've made me realize the inconsistencies I was holding in terms of getting an ought from an is and getting a will be from an is and that kind of thing, which I kind of hadn't put that together before. But now when you sort of read the problems of induction, you read Hume writing about induction, it jumps out at the page at me like this can apply to the ought thing, and I just hadn't put those together before. So I have to thank you for making the videos as well. But I'm glad to say that we're essentially, substantively speaking, in agreement now.
We are indeed.
It's one of those rare occasions, and like you said a second ago, it's worth celebrating. It's one of those rare occasions
Absolutely
where we started
celebrating
on the opposite sides of the table, saying I'm a subjectivist, you're an objectivist, and we might still like hold similar views and stuff. We might have changed what we mean by those terms or whatever, but those are like objective and subjective are essentially antitheses. They are completely opposed to each other, and we sat opposite the table without realizing we'd take the conversation quite this far all those years ago in my back garden. And yet now we're both sort of in the same place, and we've managed to do it, and it seems like it can be done. And if it can be done for morality, it can be done for free will, it can be done for religion, it can be done for politics. I'm almost certain of it. So
agreed, absolutely.
It's a bizarre place to be in. This might be, I'm sure we can discuss this in the future, but in terms of like having these debates and these long form like breakdowns and things, I think we're essentially done.
I would agree with you. I think we're pretty much done on it.
Shake my hand.
Absolutely, my friend.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's how you argue.
Yeah. And to everybody listening, to everybody who's been following the channel, and to everyone who's been following Stephen's channel and has seen this conversation evolve, to see it come to this, I won't call it a conclusion because I have no idea where we'll take this in the future, but to see it come to this agreement, like I hope it's somewhat satisfying. Even if you don't agree with us, to see us agree with each other, I think is exciting, to say the least. And thank you for sticking around. This has been the longest podcast so far, although it has only been episode 3. I'd like to remind you that if you have spent all this time listening to this podcast all the way to the end, then it takes such an incalculably less amount of time to go to iTunes, hit that 5-star rating, get us on the analytic, get us in iTunes algorithm, get us on the new and noteworthy pages for philosophy or for society and culture, education, and we will be viewed by more people and we can get better guests, and it only takes a second. You could have done it in the time since I began this sentence. I'd really appreciate it if you could do so. And for those who have already, thank you so much. It means a lot. I've been reading all of your reviews and they mean a lot. So with that said, I think that's a good place to wrap up. So if people want to see either Stephen's previous content or the videos that we've referenced, if you're watching on YouTube, links will be in the description. If not, then you can simply search Rationality Rules anywhere, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, it'll all come up.
You'll find me.
And also look out for the card game, which is coming out, Debunked, which the Kickstarter's now done for, and it's all sort of on track now.
It's making great progress. I'm really excited with how that's went, and I'm excited to make it available to the public after the Kickstarter's been done. So
yeah,
it's going to be good.
It's gonna be good. Like we played another prototype today. you brought sort of an updated version of the game with new graphics and things. We were playing it earlier, and man, I'm so excited for this game to launch. And I hope that people listening are aware of the game. If you're not, you can see it on Stephen's channel. But it's this card game that's coming out. Look out for it. I think it's going to be really good, because I'm one of the sort of few people on the planet who've actually been able to play it yet. And
yes.
I think it's a genius idea still. But okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. Do remember to subscribe either here on YouTube or here on iTunes, which you can also do, and continue to download the podcasts in the future. Thanks for being here. I've been Alex O'Connor in conversation with Stephen Woodford.
Thanks for having me.